Okay, guys, so we are actually doing our last section for the year. All right, we've done pretty well with getting through the content. We're a little bit behind, but I feel like that in general, we've done a really good job. Okay, so we are doing section 8.3, but before that, I actually want to talk about a little bit of algebra because this is going to make everything easier in the long run. Okay, so what I want to talk about first is rationalizing the denominator. And I don't know if you learned this in algebra, all right? But what we're going to be talking about today is how can we deal with square roots, okay? So, what rationalizing the denominator means is, let's say I have something like this, all right? 3 divided by the square root of 2, okay? You are not allowed to have a square root on the bottom of a fraction. All right, I don't exactly know why. It's just a rule in math, all right, but you're not allowed to have it. So we have this strategy called rationalizing the denominator that is going to remove that square root, all right, but still not change the value of that fraction, okay? So what we're going to do actually, all right, is we are going to multiply the top and the bottom by the square root of 2 over the square root of 2. Now, the reason why we can do this, all right, is what is anything divided by itself? Well, it's 1, right? So technically all we're doing is multiplying this fraction, 3 over the square root of 2 by 1. It's just a different form of 1, okay? So let's remember how we multiply fractions. So when we multiply fractions, we multiply straight across, right? So I can't combine the 3 and the 2 because the square root of 2 is underneath the radical, all right? So this would become 3 times the square root of 2. You just stick the 3 right out in front, all right, all over. But because the 2's are both underneath both underneath the radical, we can multiply those together and stick them back underneath the radical. So the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 becomes the square root of 4, okay? Now, what is the square root of 4? Well, it's 2, right? So this then becomes 3 over the square root of 2 over 2. Now, to talk about simplifying, all right, this is our final answer right here, okay? I'm going to tell you what you're not allowed to do, all right? You're not allowed to simplify stuff that is underneath the radical and stuff that's not underneath the radical. So you couldn't simplify the square root of 2 and 2 because the 2 is not underneath the square root, okay? Now, if the 3, all right, and the 2 were divisible by the same thing, you could simplify those, all right? But because they're not, this whole thing is my final answer, okay? Let's try another one. So let's say I have 5 over the square root of 3. All right, once again, I'm going to multiply by the square root of 3 over the square root of 3. Okay, multiplying straight across, you're going to get 5 times the square root of 3. You can't simplify you can't put those together because one's underneath a radical, one's not. All over the square root of 3 times the square root of 3 is the square root of 9. All right, the square root of 9 reduces into 3. All right, and because these aren't divisible by the same thing, this whole thing is my final answer. So what you should notice in here is that we had a pattern. The square root of 2 times the square root of 2 becomes the square root of 4, which is equal to 2. The square root of 3 times the square root of 3 becomes the square root of 9, which is equal to 3. So essentially, when you multiply a radical by itself, the product of that is just going to be what's underneath the radical. So for example, the square root of 7 times the square root of 7 is equal to 7, all right? The square root of 8 times the square root of 8 becomes 8, all right? So you don't even have to do this step right here where you make it the square root of 4, the square root of 9. You could just jump straight to 2 and 3, okay? Now, let's try one, though, where let's say that you have like the square root of, let's do the square root of 2 over the square root of 3, okay? Now, we are going to multiply the top and the bottom once again by the square root of 3 over the square root of 3. But what's different about this one is that these right here, all right, are both underneath the radical. So we can multiply those together and we're going to get the square root of 6 all over the square root of 3 times square root of 3 we just talked about is going to be equal to 3. And then because 6 is underneath the radical and 3 is not, we cannot go any further with simplifying, so that's going to be our final answer. All right? Let's do one last one, okay, where let's say I have 4 times the square, or actually, let's just do 4 over the square root of 2, okay? All right, so once again, we're going to multiply by the square root of 2 over the square root of 2. Multiply straight across, 4 times the square root of 2 over the square root of 2 times the square root of 2 is 2, okay? Now, take a look at the 4 and the 2. Are these able to be simplified? They are, all right? So then this is going to become 2 times the square root of 2, and that's my final answer, okay? All right, so I'm going to pause there, and then that was just kind of giving us some background information before we actually start the notes.